Greatness and rareness of the discovery of forgiveness in God, the reasons of it, testimonies of conscience and law against it, and so on. This discovery of forgiveness in God is great, holy, and mysterious, and which very few on gospel grounds attain to. All men indeed say there is forgiveness with God. Most men are persuaded that they think so. Only men in great and desperate extremities like Cain or Francis Spira or Judas seem to call it into question. But their thoughts are empty, groundless, yea, for the most part wicked and atheistical. Elihu tells us that to declare this a right to a sinful soul, it is a work of a messenger, an interpreter, one among 1,000. Job 33, verse 23. That is, indeed, of Christ himself. The common thoughts of men about this thing are slight and foolish. As explained by the psalmist in Psalm 50, verse 21, they think that God is altogether such an one as themselves, that indeed he takes little or no care about these things, but passes over them as slightly as they do themselves, that notwithstanding all their pretenses, the most of men never had indeed any real discovery of forgiveness. There is a difference between their vain credulity and a gracious gospel discovery of forgiveness in God. For it must be observed that by this discovery I intend both the revelation of it made by God and our understanding and reception of that revelation to our own advantage. There are reasons for the difficulty intimated, and they consist partly in the hindrances that lie in this way of this discovery, and partly in the nature of the thing itself that is discovered. Before I proceed, somewhat must be premised to show what it is that I particularly intend by a discovery of forgiveness. It may then be considered in two ways. First, for a doctrinal objective discovery of it in its truth. Secondly, an experimental subjective discovery of it in its power. In the first sense, forgiveness in God has been discovered ever since the giving out of the first promise. God revealed it in a word of promise, or it could never have been known, as shall be afterward declared. In this sense, after many lesser degrees and advancements of the light of it, it was fully and gloriously brought forth by the Lord Jesus Christ in his own person, and is now revealed and preached in the gospel, and by them to whom the word of reconciliation is committed, and to declare this as the principal work of the pastors of the gospel. In this lie those unsearchable treasures and riches of Christ, which the apostle esteemed as his chiefest honor and privilege, that he was entrusted with the declaration and dispensation of. Ephesians 3, 8 and 9. I know by many gospel forgiveness is despised, by many traduced, whose ignorance and blindness is to be lamented. But the day is coming which will manifest every man's work of what sort it is. In a latter sense, how it is made by faith in the soul, shall in its proper place be further open and made known. Here many men mistake and deceive themselves. Because it is so in the book, they think it is so in them also. Because they have been taught it, they think they believe it. But it is not so. They have not heard this voice of God at any time, nor seen his shape. It has not been revealed to them in its power. To have this done is a great work, for first, the constant voice of conscience lies against it. Conscience, if not seared, inexorably condemns and pronounces wrath and anger upon the soul that has the least guilt cleaving to it. Now it has this advantage. It lies close to the soul, and by importunity and loud speaking it will be heard in what it has to say. It will make the whole soul pay attention, or it will speak like thunder. And its constant voice is that where there is guilt, there must be judgment. Romans 2, verses 14 and 15. Conscience naturally knows nothing of forgiveness. Yea, it is against its very trust, work, and office to hear anything of it. If a man of courage and honesty be entrusted to keep a garrison against an enemy, let one come and tell him that there is peace made between those whom he serves and their enemies, so that he may leave his guard and set open the gates and cease his watchfulness. How wary will he be, lest under this pretense he be betrayed? No, he says, I will keep my hold until I have express order from my superiors. Conscience is entrusted with the power of God in the soul of a sinner, with command to keep all in subjection with reference to the judgment to come. It will not betray its trust in believing every report of peace. No, but this it says, and it speaks in the name of God. Guilt and punishment are inseparable twins. If the soul sin, God will judge, says conscience. What are you telling me of forgiveness? I know what my commission is, and I will abide by that. You shall not bring in a superior commander, a cross principle, into my trust. For if this be so, it seems I must let go my throne. Another Lord must come in, not knowing as yet how this whole business is compounded in the blood of Christ. Now whom should a man believe if not his own conscience, which, as it will not flatter him, so it intends not to affright him, but to speak the truth, as the matter requires. Conscience has two works in reference to sin. One to condemn the acts of sin, another to judge the person of the sinner, both with reference to the judgment of God. When forgiveness comes, it would sever and part these employments and take one of them out of the hand of conscience. It would divide the spoil with this strong one. It shall condemn the fact, or every sin, but it shall no more condemn the sinner. The person of the sinner, that shall be freed from its sentence. Here conscience labors with all its might to keep its whole dominion, and to keep out the power of forgiveness from being enthroned in the soul. It will allow men to talk of forgiveness, to hear it preached, though they abuse it every day, but to receive it in its power, that stands up in direct opposition to conscience's dominion. In the kingdom, saith conscience, I will be greater than you. And in many, in the most, it keeps its possession and will not be deposed. And it isn't an easy work to deal with the conscience. The apostle tells us that all the sacrifices of the law could not do it. Hebrews 10, verse 2. They could not bring a man into that state in which he should have no more conscience of sin. That is, conscience condemning a person, for conscience in a sense of sin and condemnation of it is never to be taken away. And this can be no otherwise done but by the blood of Christ, as the apostle at large there declares. It is then no easy thing to make a discovery of forgiveness to a soul when the work and employment which conscience, upon unquestionable grounds, challenges to itself, lies in opposition to it. Hence is the soul's great desire to establish its own righteousness in which its natural principles may be preserved in their power. Let self-righteousness be enthroned, and natural conscience desires no more. It is satisfied and pacified. The law it knows, and righteousness it knows, but as for forgiveness, it says, whence is it? To the utmost, until Christ perfects his conquest. There are on this account secret strugglings in the heart against free pardon in the gospel, and fluctuations of mind and spirit about it. Yea, hence are the doubts and fears of believers themselves. They are nothing but the strivings of conscience to keep its whole dominion, to condemn the sinner as well as the sin. More or less it keeps up its pretensions against the gospel while we live in this world. It is a great work that the blood of Christ has to do upon the conscience of a sinner. For whereas, as it has been declared, it has a power and claims a right to condemn both sin and sinner. The one part of this, its power, is to be cleared, strengthened, made more active, vigorous, and watchful. The other, to be taken quite away. It shall now see more sins than formerly, more of the vileness of all sins than formerly, and condemn them with more abhorrency than ever, upon more and more glorious accounts than formerly. But it is also made to see an interposition between these sins and the person of the sinner who has committed them, which is no small or ordinary work. But secondly, the law lies against this discovery. The moral law is a beam of the holiness of God himself. What it speaks to us, it speaks in the name and an authority of God, and I shall briefly show concerning it these two things. Number one, that this is the voice of the law, namely, that there is no forgiveness for a sinner. Number two, that a sinner has great reason to give credit to the law in that assertion. First, it is certain that the law knows neither mercy nor forgiveness. The very sanction of it lies wholly against them. The soul that sinneth, it shall die. Cursed is he that continueth not in all things in the book of the law to do them. Deuteronomy 27:26. Galatians 3 verse 10. Hence the apostle pronounces universally without exception that they who are under the law are under the curse. Galatians 3:10. And he says in verse 12, the law is not of faith. There is an inconsistency between the law and believing. They cannot have their abode and power together. Do this and live. Fail to do this, and you die, is the constant immutable voice of the law. This it speaks in general to all, and this in particular to every one. Number two, the sinner seems to have manifold and weighty reasons to attend to the voice of this law, and to acquiesce in its sentence. For first, the law is connatural to him, his domestic, his old acquaintance. It came into the world with him and has grown up with him from his infancy. It was implanted in his heart by nature, is his own reason. He can never shake it off or part with it. It is his familiar, his friend, that cleaves to him as a flesh to the bone, so that they who have not the law written cannot but show forth the work of the law, Romans 2 verses 14 and 15, and that because the law itself is inbred to them, and all the faculties of the soul are at peace with it, in subjection to it. It is a bond and ligament of their union, harmony, and correspondency among themselves in all their moral actings. It gives life, order, motion to them all. Now the gospel that comes to control this sentence of the law and to relieve the sinner from it is foreign to his nature, a strange thing to him, a thing he has no acquaintance or familiarity with. It has not been bred up with him, nor is there anything in him to side with it, to make a party for it, or to plead in its behalf. Now shall not a man rather believe a domestic, a friend, indeed himself, than a foreigner, a stranger that comes with uncouth principles, and such as suit not its reason at all? 1 Corinthians 1:18. Secondly, the law speaks nothing to a sinner but what his conscience assures him to be true. There is a constant concurrence in the testimony of the law and conscience. When the law says this or that is a sin worthy of death, conscience says it is even so. Romans 1 verse 32. Where the law of itself, as being a general rule, rests, conscience helps it on, and says this and that sin, so worthy of death, is the soul guilty of. Then die, saith the law, as you have deserved. Now this must needs have a mighty efficacy to prevail with the soul to give credit to the report and testimony of the law. It speaks not one word, but what he hath a witness within himself to the truth of. These witnesses always agree, and so it seems to be established for a truth that there is no forgiveness. Number 3, the moral law, though it speak against the soul's interest, yet it speaks nothing but what is so just, righteous, and equal, that it even forces the soul's consent. So Paul tells us that men know the voice of the law to be the judgment of God, Romans 1 verse 32. They know it, and cannot but consent to it, that it is the judgment of God, that is good, righteous, equal, not to be controlled. And indeed, what can be more righteous than its sentence? It commands obedience to the God of life and death, promises a reward, and declares that for non-performance of duty death will be inflicted. On these terms a sinner comes into the world. They are good, righteous, holy. The soul accepts of them and knows not what it can desire better or more equal. This the apostle insists upon in chapter 7 verse 12 and 13. Wherefore the law is holy, and the commandment holy and just and good. Was then that which was good made death to me? God forbid. But sin, that it might appear sin, working death in me by that which is good, that sin by the commandment might become exceeding sinful. Wherever the blame falls, the souls cannot but acquit the law and confess that what it says is righteous and uncontrollably equal. And it is fitting that things should be so. Now, though the authority and credit of a witness may go very far in a doubtful matter, when there is a concurrence of more witnesses, it strengthens the testimony. But nothing is so prevalent to beget belief as when the things themselves that are spoken are just and good, not liable to any reasonable exception. And so is it in this case. To the authority of the law and concurrence of conscience, this also is added, the reasonableness and equity of the thing itself proposed, even in the judgment of the sinner, namely that every sin shall be punished, and every transgression receive a meet recompense of reward. Number 4, but yet further, what the law says, it speaks in the name and authority of God. What it says, then, must be believed, or we make God a liar. It doesn't come in its own name, but in the name of Him who appointed it. You will say, then, is it so indeed? Is there no forgiveness with God? For this is the constant voice of the law, which ye say speaks in the name and authority of God, and is therefore to be believed. I answer briefly with the apostle, what the law speaks, it speaks to them that are under the law. It does not speak to them that are in Christ, whom the law of the Spirit of life has set free from the law of sin and death. But to them that are under the law it speaks. And it speaks of very truth, and it speaks in the name of God, and its testimony is to be received. It says there is no forgiveness in God, namely to them that are under the law, and they that shall flatter themselves with a contrary persuasion will find themselves woefully mistaken at the great day. On these and the like considerations, I say, there seems to be a great deal of reason why a soul should conclude that it will be according to the testimony of the law, and that he shall not find forgiveness. Law and conscience come together and insinuate themselves into the thoughts, mind, and judgment of a sinner. They strengthen the testimony of one another and greatly prevail. If any are otherwise minded, I leave them to the trial, If ever God awakened their consciences to a thorough performance of their duty, if ever he opened their souls and let in the light and power of the law upon them, they will find it no small work to grapple with them. I am sure that eventually they prevail so far that in the preaching of the gospel we have a great cause to say, Lord, who hath believed our report? We come with our report of forgiveness, but who believes it? By whom is it received? Neither does the light, nor conscience, nor conversation of the most allow us to suppose it is embraced. Thirdly, the engrafted notions that are in the minds of men concerning the nature and justice of God lie against this discovery also. They are in all men by nature indelible characters of the holiness and purity of God, of his justice and hatred of sin, of his invariable righteousness in the government of the world, that they can neither depose nor lay aside. For notions of God, whatever they are, will bear sway and roll in the heart when things are put to the trial. They were in the heathens of old. They abode with him in all their darkness, as might be manifested by innumerable examples. But so it is in all men by nature. Their inward thought is that God is an avenger of sin, that it belongs to his rule and government of the world, his holiness and righteousness, to take care that every sin be punished. This is his judgment, which all men know, as was observed before, Romans 1, verse 32. They know that it is a righteous thing with God to render tribulation unto sinners. From thence is that dread and fear which surprises men in an apprehension of the presence of God, or of anything under him, above them, that may seem to come on his errand. This notion of God's avenging all sin exerts itself secretly but effectually. So Adam trembled and hid himself. And it was the saying of old, I have seen God and shall die. When men are under any dreadful providence, thunderings, lightnings, tempests, in darkness, they tremble, not so much at what they see or hear or feel as from their secret thoughts that God is near, and that he is a consuming fire. Now these inbred notions lie universally against all apprehensions of forgiveness which must be brought into the soul from without doors, having no principle of nature to promote them. It is true, men by nature have presumptions and common engrafted notions of other properties of God besides his holiness and justice, as of his goodness, benignity, love of his creatures, and the like. But all these have the supposition inlaid with them in the souls of men, namely, that all things stand between God and his creatures as they did at their first creation, and as they have no natural notion of forgiveness, so the interposition of sin weakens, disturbs, darkens them, as to any improvement of those apprehensions of goodness and benignity which they have. If they have any notion of forgiveness, it is from some corrupt tradition, and not at all from any universal principle that is inbred in nature, such as are those which they have of God's holiness and vindictive justice. And this is the first ground from whence it appears that a real solid discovery of forgiveness is indeed a great work. Many difficulties and hindrances lie in the way of its accomplishment. False presumptions of forgiveness discovered, and differences between them and evangelical faith. Before I proceed to produce and manage the remaining evidences of this truth, because what has been spoken lies obnoxious and open to an objection, which must needs rise in the minds of many, that it may not thereby be rendered useless to them, I shall remove it out of the way, that we may pass on to what remains. It will then be said, does not all this lie directly contrary to our daily experience? Do you not find all men full enough, most too full of apprehensions of forgiveness with God? What so common is that God is merciful? Are not the consciences and convictions of the most stifled by this apprehension? Can you find a man that is otherwise minded? Is it not a common complaint that men presume on it to their eternal ruin? Certainly, then, that which all men do, which every man can so easily do, and which you cannot keep men off from doing, though it be to their hurt, has no such difficulty in it as is pretended. And on this very account has this weak endeavor to demonstrate this truth been by some laughed to scorn. Men who have taken upon them the teaching of others, but as it seems had need to be taught themselves the very first principles of the oracles of God. Answer. All this, then, I say, is so, and much more to this purpose may be spoken. The folly and presumption of poor souls in this can never be enough lamented. But it is one thing to embrace a cloud, a shadow, another to have the truth in reality. I shall hereafter show the true nature of forgiveness, and wherein it does consist, in which the vanity of the self-deceiving will be discovered and laid open. It will appear in the issue that notwithstanding all their pretensions, the most of men know nothing at all, nor anything to the purpose of that which is under consideration. I shall therefore for the present in some few observations show how far this delusion of many differs from a true gospel discovery of forgiveness, such as that we are inquiring after. First, the common notion of forgiveness that men have in the world is twofold. Number one, an atheistical presumption on God that he is not so just and holy, or not just and holy in such a way and manner as he is by some represented, is the ground of their persuasion of forgiveness. Men think that some declarations of God are fitted only to make them mad, that he takes little notice of these things, and that what he does he will easily pass by, as they suppose better becomes him. Come, let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we shall die. This is their inward thought. The Lord will not do good, neither will he do evil. Which, says the psalmist, is men thinking that God is such an one as himself, Psalm 50, verse 21. They have no deep, nor serious thoughts of his greatness, holiness, purity, severity, but think that he is like themselves so far as not to be much moved with what they do. What thoughts they have of sin, the same they think God has. If with them a slight ejaculation be enough to expiate sin, that their consciences be no more troubled, they think it is enough with God that it be not punished. The generality of men make light work of sin, and yet in nothing doth it more appear what thoughts they have of God. He that has slight thoughts of sin had never great thoughts of God. Indeed, men's undervaluing of sin arises merely from their contempt of God. All sin's concernments flow from its relation to God, and as men's apprehensions are of God, so will they be of sin, which is in opposition to him. This is the frame of the most of men. They know little of God, and are little troubled about anything that relates to him. God is not reverenced. Sin is but a trifle. Forgiveness a matter of nothing. Whoso will may have it for asking. But shall this atheistical wickedness of the heart of man be called a discovery of forgiveness? Is not this to make God an idol? He who is not acquainted with God's holiness and purity, who knows not sin's desert and sinfulness, knows nothing of forgiveness. Number two, from the doctrine of the gospel commonly preached and made known, there is a general notion begotten in the minds of men that God is ready to forgive. Men, I say, from hence have a doctrinal apprehension of this truth without any real satisfactory foundation of that apprehension as to themselves. This they have heard. This they have been often told, so they think, and so they resolve to do. A general persuasion hereof spreads itself over all to whom the sound of the gospel comes. It is not fiducially resolved into the gospel, but it is an opinion growing out of the report of it. Some relief men find by it in the common course of their conversation, in the duties of worship which they perform, as also in their troubles and distresses, in which internal and of conscience, or external, and of providence, so they resolve to retain it. And this is that which I shall briefly speak to, and therein manifest the differences between this common prevailing apprehension of forgiveness and faith's discovery of it to the soul and its power. That which we reject is loose and general, not fixed, engrafted, or planted on the mind. So is it always where the minds of men receive things only in their notion and not in their power. It lacks a fixedness and foundation which defects accompany all notions of the mind that are only retained in the memory, not implanted in the judgment. They have general thoughts of it, which they use as occasion serves. They hear that God is a merciful God, and such as they intend to deal with him, for the true bottom, rise, and foundation of it. Upon what account the pure and holy God, who will do no iniquity, the righteous God, whose judgment it is that they that commit sin are worthy of death, should yet pardon iniquity, transgression, and sin, they don't weigh it. They don't consider it, or if they do, it is in a slight and notional way, as they consider the thing itself. They take it for granted, so it is, and are never put seriously upon the inquiry how it comes to be so, and that because indeed they have no real concern in it. How many thousands may we meet with who take it for granted that forgiveness is to be had with God, that never yet had any serious exercise in their souls about the grounds of it, and its consistency with his holiness and justice. But those that know it by faith have a sense of it fixed particularly and distinctly on their minds. They have been put upon an inquiry into the rising grounds of it in Christ, so that on a good and unquestionable foundation they can go to God and say, there is forgiveness with you. They see how and by what means more glory comes to God by forgiveness than by punishing of sin, which is a matter that the other sort of men are not at all solicitous about. If they may escape punishment, whether God have any glory or not, for the most part they are indifferent. Number 2. The first apprehension arises without any trial upon inquiry in the consciences of them in whom it is. They have not, by the power of their convictions and distresses of conscience, been put to make inquiry whether the thing be so or not. It is not a persuasion that they have arrived to in a way of seeking satisfaction to their own souls. It is not the result of a deep inquiry after peace and rest. It is antecedent to trial and experience, and so is not faith, but opinion. For although faith be not experience, yet it is inseparable from it, as is every practical habit. Distresses in their consciences have been prevented by this opinion, not removed. The reason why the most of men are not troubled about their sins to any purpose is from a persuasion that God is merciful and will pardon, when indeed none can really on a gospel account ordinarily have that persuasion, but those who have been troubled for sin, and that to the purpose. So is it with them that make this discovery by faith. They have had conflicts in their own spirits, and being deprived of peace, have accomplished a diligent search whether forgiveness were to be obtained or not. The persuasion they have of it, be it more or less, is the issue of a trial they have had in their own souls, of an inquiry how things stood between God and them as to peace and acceptation of their persons. This is a vast difference. The one sort might possibly have had trouble in their consciences about sin, had it not been for their opinion of forgiveness. This has prevented or stifled their convictions, not healed their wounds, which is a work of the gospel, but kept them from being wounded, which is a work of security. Yea, here lies the ruin of the most of them who perish under the preaching of the gospel. They have received the general notion of pardon. It floats in their minds, and presently presents itself to their relief on all occasions. Does God at any time in the dispensation of the word, under an affliction, upon some great sin against their ruling light, begin to deal with their consciences, before their conviction can ripen or come to any perfection? Before it draw nigh to its perfect work, they choke it, and heal their consciences with this notion of pardon. Many a man between the assembly and his dwelling house is thus cured. You may see them go away shaking their heads and striking on their breasts, and before they come home be as whole as ever. Well, God is merciful. There is pardon, has wrought the cure. The other sort have obtained their persuasion as a result of the discovery of Christ in the gospel upon a full conviction. Trials they have had, and this is the issue. Number 3. The one which we reject works no love to God, no delight in him, no reverence of him, but rather a contempt and commonness of spirit in dealing with him. There are none in the world that deal worse with God than those who have an ungrounded persuasion of forgiveness. And if they do fear him or love him or obey him in anything more or less, it is on other motives and considerations, which will not render anything they do acceptable, and not at all on this. As he is good to the creation, they may love. As he is great and powerful, they may fear him. But sense of pardon, as to any such ends or purposes, has no power upon them. Carnal boldness, formality, and despising of God are the common issues of such a notion and persuasion. Indeed, this is a generation of great sinners in the world, men who have a general apprehension, but not a sense of the special power of pardon. Openly or secretly, in fleshly or spiritual sins, are the great sinners among men. Where faith makes a discovery of forgiveness, all things are otherwise. Great love, fear, and reverence of God are its attendants. Mary Magdalene loved much because much was forgiven. Great love will spring out of great forgiveness. There is forgiveness with thee, saith the psalmist, that thou mayest be feared. No unbeliever does truly and experimentally know the truth of this inference. But so it is with men. Fear the Lord and his goodness, Hosea 3:5. I say then, where pardoning mercy is truly apprehended, where faith makes a discovery of it to the soul, it is endeared to God and possessed of the great springs of love, delight, fear, and reverence. Number 4. This notional apprehension of the pardon of sin begets no serious, thorough hatred and detestation of sin, nor is prevalent to a relinquishment of it. Nay, it rather secretly insinuates into the soul encouragements to a continuance in it. It is the nature of it to lessen and extenuate sin, and to support the soul against its convictions. So Jude tells us that some turn the grace of God into lasciviousness, verse 4. And he says, they are ungodly men. Let them profess what they will, they are ungodly men. But how can they turn the grace of our God into lasciviousness? Is grace capable of a conversion into lust or sin? Will what was once grace ever become wantonness? It is objective, not subjective grace. The doctrine, not the real substance of grace, it is intended. The doctrine of forgiveness is this grace of God which may be thus abused. From hence do men who have only a general notion of it habitually draw secret encouragements to sin and folly. Paul also lets us know that carnal men come into a doctrinal acquaintance with gospel grace are very apt to make such conclusions, Romans 6, verse 1. And it will appear at the last day how unspeakably this glorious grace has been perverted in the world. It would be well for many if they had never heard the name of forgiveness. It is otherwise where this revelation is received, indeed, in the soul by believing, Romans 6:14. Our being under grace, under the power of the belief of forgiveness, is our great preservative from our being under the power of sin. Faith of forgiveness is the principle of gospel obedience, Titus 2:11 and 12. Number 5. The general notion of forgiveness brings with it no sweetness, no rest to the soul. Flashes of joy it may, abiding rest it does not. The truth of the doctrine fluctuates to and fro in the minds of those that have it, but their wills and affections have no solid delight nor rest by it. Hence, notwithstanding all that profession that is made in the world of forgiveness, the most of men ultimately resolve their peace and comfort to themselves, as their apprehensions are of their own doing, good or evil, according to their ruling light, whatever it be, so as to peace and rest are they secretly tossed up and down. Every one in his several way pleases himself with what he does in answer to his own convictions, and is disquieted as to his state and condition, according as he seems to himself to come short of it. To make a full life of contention upon pardon, they know not how to do it. One duty yields them more true repose than many thoughts of forgiveness. But faith finds sweetness and rest in it, being thereby apprehended. It is the only harbor of the soul. It leads a man to God as good, to Christ as rest. Fading, evented joys do oftentimes attend the one, but solid delight with constant obedience are the fruits only of the other. Number 6. Those who have the former only take up their persuasion on false grounds, though the thing itself be true, and they cannot but use it to false ends and purposes, besides its natural and genuine tendency. For their grounds it will be discovered when I come to treat of the true nature of gospel forgiveness. For the end it is used generally only to fill up what is wanting. Self-righteousness is their bottom, and when that is too short or narrow to cover them, they piece it out by forgiveness. Where conscience accuses, they must supply the defect. Faith lays it on its proper foundation, of which afterwards also, and it uses it to its proper end, namely, to be the sole and only ground of our acceptance with God. That is the proper use of forgiveness, that all may be of grace, for when the foundation is pardon, the whole superstructure must needs be grace. From what has been spoken, it is evident that notwithstanding the pretenses to the contrary, insinuated in the objection now removed, it is a great thing to have gospel forgiveness discovered to a soul in a saving manner.